So as we continue on to look at ecology, we're going to continue to look at some more of these factors that are affecting the population of organisms that are out there. And again, think about things that we've looked at, our density and our age structure that's out there and the survivorship. One of the other factors that we can look at is something that's known as the growth rate. And when you look at your population growth models that are out there, no natural population fits these models perfectly, but we do see that what are known as density-dependent factors are really going to come into play and regulate the population size. And so when you're looking at this, think about that density, the number of individuals that are living in a given area. You're going to run into some competition for your limited availability of resources, food, water, space to live. But on the other side, the other thing that happens is the more dense a population is, the more you can start to accumulate a bunch of waste products that can actually be toxic. And if we look over here on this side, we see what's known as the exponential growth model. And this, if you look at your population size over time, you can see this population is rapidly expanding, and you get what's known as the J curve right here. And when you're looking at exponential growth, you're basically looking at a place where your resources are unlimited. And so each generation is going to produce a whole bunch of new organisms that are out there. So you get this exponential growth in that population. And when we look at sort of a more realistic version of this, the environments that are out there, you do run into limitations in the resources that are available. And when you start factoring those in, now you're starting to look at your carrying capacity. And this is really looking at the maximum population size that the environment can actually sustain right there. And with this, you do start to see that J curve coming into play. But as you approach your carrying capacity, your population is going to start to level off right here. You're running out of resources. You're building up some of those toxic waste products. And so this is known as the logistic growth model. And you can see it gives you sort of an S-shaped curve right here that we looked at. And remember, you go through this lag phase at the beginning of this process here as the organisms are getting used to the environment, and once they accumulate enough resources, then they're going to start to reproduce, and you run into that exponential growth in what's known as the log phase. And then once you hit your carrying capacity, you enter that stationary phase. And if things turn perilous, you can see that death phase coming off of here in the fourth phase that we don't really see in this, because most populations are basically going to stabilize there, and you're going to have that competition, but you're going to be able to reproduce and basically get as close as possible to that carrying capacity out there. When we look at our own human population growth, we can see that if you look at these years back here, even going back a few thousand years, your number of births and your number of deaths were about equal. And so you're really looking at that lag phase, and our world population basically did not start to increase until a few hundred years ago, really 500 years ago. When we're looking at some of the stuff, you start to see that gradual increase, and then we really entered that exponential phase right here when you're looking at really since the maybe 1800s, early 1900s, our population began to grow exponentially. And you think about, well, what changed during this time period? People started to get some better nutrition out there. They were eating better. We started to clean up things, and we had better sanitation and better health care, which means your population's going to be able to survive to the age where you can reproduce effectively, and you're going to have more births than you do have deaths that are out there. And so now you're going to start to get this growth right here. And the question that we look at when we really have to start thinking about this is, when do we run into our carrying capacity? When are we going to have this battle over resources that are available for all the people on the planet? And remember, the other thing that we have to consider is we are causing damage to our ecosystem and the biodiversity of life that is out there. So is it possible that we are actually lowering the carrying capacity for the humans on the planet? And remember, that's where that death phase comes in. So how close we are to the carrying capacity is something where people are going back and forth and debating what is going on and how much we can continue to grow as a population out there, because we are in that exponential phase where we are constantly growing faster and faster and faster. And one way that we can actually study what's going on is what's known as an age structure diagram. And so if you look at this, you're looking at these age groups right here, and then you can compare the males and the females in the population and compare what's going on with this. So you're looking at the proportion of the population that fits into these different age categories, but also looking at the relative proportion of the population in these age classes and the gender that comes into play. And you can really use these age structure diagrams to help predict what's going on with the population and maybe look at the future growth. And what's really interesting is we can also learn a little something about the social conditions that are going on with that population. The first one that we see over here, you've got a rapid growth that is going on that narrows down to this point. So you're getting a huge amount of growth towards the bottom of this curve. And then as you age, you're getting a decrease in the number of individuals. So there you've got a lot of growth with the reproductive kinds of, or members of that population. Over here we can see that similar kind of thing, but notice these guys are not as steep in terms of the growth that's going on, and this would indicate a little bit slower growth there. The number of individuals are decreasing steadily as you get a look at older and older parts of the population. The third stage over here, we see what's known as a stable population diagram, and notice this one is rounded on the top. So you've got this rapid growth that's going on, and then as you get older, you're starting to get a gradual decrease, and then over here you're getting a much, much faster decrease in the proportion of your population that fits into this category right here. So you've really got a stable kind of population that's going on over here. And if we look at this one, this is a really interesting one for our stage 4 diagram with the age structure. And think about what's going on with this. There are very few children in this population right here. And once you hit reproductive age, then you're starting to see a little bit of an expansion right there. But then you can see this is starting to decrease as we work our way up here. And so this would really be an indication that your population is shrinking. And again, like I said, this can help us to show about population growth right here. And so think about how we could apply this to different kinds of countries that are out there and look at their population and see. We can use this age structure to also start to look at the human population and see about what kind of growth is going on across the world. And if you look at this figure, you can see these countries that are highlighted with sort of this reddish purple color, like we can see all of these different countries, parts of Europe, and then all the way across Eurasia over here. You're looking at there's actually negative growth in their population. We look at these gray countries, we can see there's a little bit of growth going on here. And you go to these purple countries, there's a little bit more growth. You go to these yellow countries, there's a huge amount of population growth occurring in these kinds of countries that are out there. And when you look at this, this is really kind of a scary kind of figure, because what we know is when we look at consumption throughout the world, the richest countries that are out there will only account for about 20% of the global population. But if you look at their impact, they are using more than 80% of the available resources. The rest of the world, 80% of the world, is using less than 20% of the resources. But notice, when you look at some of these areas out there, remember what I said, these can indicate something about socioeconomic status. These countries are very poor, but they've got a huge amount of population growth that is going on there. So again, this idea of population ecology allows us to look at some of the interesting kinds of facts about these different kinds of organisms that are out there. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit and work our way up the ladder and start to look at community ecology. And these are really complex systems where you're looking at these groups of populations and how they interact with each other. And so we're going to look at the structure of these populations and how they interact in terms of the number and size of their populations, but also see about how these interactions change over time in this very dynamic kind of interaction. So we're going to understand a little bit about what's going on with multiple populations of organisms here. And if we look at our community ecology out there, we can see a variety of different kinds of communities here in these different figures. And when you look at that, if you have a relatively constant number of species, that community is said to be at an equilibrium. And if there's some sort of disturbance, that can knock that community off as different populations are favored, and hopefully it's a stable community where they can actually return back to that equilibrium. When we look at this, there are a couple of different species that are really important for different communities. One of them is what's known as the foundation species, and this is really the bedrock of the community. It has the greatest influence on the overall structure. So if you're looking out there in the ocean, something like kelp or coral would be a foundation species because they're going to provide really the environment where all these different kinds of organisms can get together. If you look at what's known as a keystone species, this is one where if you remove it, it's going to have a drastic effect on a variety of different kinds of populations that are living in that particular ecosystem that's out there. And a good example of this is if you look at some of these intertidal zones, if you actually get rid of sea stars in that zone, that's going to allow the mussels to take over because the sea stars are the keystone that is going to maintain the population of these other organisms. And another really important one to look at for community ecology is invasive species. So non-native organisms that will actually invade a community and outcompete the native species for the resources. And we can see these with different kinds of carp that are being introduced from Asia and also mussels that are out there. They're coming into North America and there's no native species or way of reducing their population, and so these are just growing out of control. This idea of community ecology is really kind of interesting because you can look at the biodiversity, the number of different species that are living in a particular area, and start to understand a little bit more about all those diverse populations that are interacting. And we can measure what's known as the species richness to describe the number of species that are living in a particular area. In this example, we can actually take a look at what's known as the predator-prey relationship, and this is allowing us to understand how these interactions are going on between the species. And when you look at this, you actually find that it comes in cycles right here. And what we see is when the number of hares or rabbits is going up, the predator that feeds off of them is going to be able to get access to all those extra resources. And notice, the rabbits go up, the lynx is going up too, and when the rabbits go down, the lynx population goes down. Then so this is known as the boom-bust cycles. Both of these populations are sort of dependent on each other there for their numbers. And a lot of organisms are going to come up with different defense mechanisms to block predation, or if you're a plant, you can block things that are eating you. And those are very, very strong selective agents when we look at evolution and natural selection out there. And there's a variety of different mechanisms that organisms have come up with to protect themselves, either things like armor or thorns, or coming up with different kinds of chemicals if you're a plant that could be toxic to animals, and even things like animals eating specific kinds of plants to make them taste bad, and that's what you actually see with monarch butterflies and caterpillars that are out there. This example is really kind of an interesting one. You can actually see that this species of paramecium is able to grow fine on its own in the laboratory, but when you mix those two species together, what we can see is one species is going to dominate. So think about this idea in terms of natural selection. This population is winning that battle for those resources in the laboratory, and this is the one that would win that struggle for resources. And so what you're looking at is this competition between these two populations of organisms. And overall, when we look at this interspecific Inter-specific competition, think up again about that idea of there is variation amongst these different individuals within that population, so some of them are going to be better adapted.